All right, today I have the pleasure of sitting here with Dr. Martin Sherman. He was born in South Africa, moved to Israel in 1971, was 7 years with the security establishment here in Israel, was the minister advisor to Yitzhak Shemiak's government, and lectured approximately 20 years in Tel Aviv and Bar-Ilan University. Was a writer for the Jerusalem Post, involved in international media as well, and is the founder and director for Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for the interview.
I'm very excited to get the chance to talk with you, especially about these issues about indigenous land rights here in Israel, Jewish indigenous land rights as well, specifically. It's kind of a monumental time, having just had the UN resolution that was not vetoed by the United States. Quite a slap in the face to Israel, as we've seen. And I'd like to see if you could give us a general review of your impressions of both the two-state and one-state solutions.
Okay, well, I think the first thing that you have to understand is that for Israel to endure as the nation state of the Jewish people, it has to address adequately two imperatives: the geographic imperative and the demographic imperative. In my opinion, that's almost axiomatic, because if it doesn't address either one of these imperatives adequately, it'll either become untenable geographically or untenable demographically. Now, the two-state solution, I think many people agree, and I think it's probably easy to show any unbiased bystander or interested person that the two-state solution will make Israel untenable geographically. I mean, there's really no reason to believe that if Israel was to withdraw from the highlands overlooking the coastal plain, the only international airport, vital traffic axes and arteries, vital infrastructure and basic industries. There's no way that all this would be in range of weapons being used today from territory that Israel has evacuated before. So this is not really scaremongering. This is just the empirical precedent. So there's no way that I think that Israel could maintain any economic or social routine in the coastal plain if any hostile forces took over the highlands overlooking that plain. On the other hand, I don't think that the one-state solution, which is normally presented as enfranchising or potentially enfranchising the Arab residents in Judea and Samaria, would address adequately the demographic imperative. Because even if optimistic demographers are correct, and Israel would annex the territory with a Jewish majority of about 65% and an Arab minority or a Muslim minority of 35%, I don't believe that that could be a cohesive and stable society. I don't think that you could expect such a large Muslim minority to act in a way which reflects any loyalty to the state, the acceptance of state symbols, the anthem, the calendar, the language. And I think it would be a recipe for the Islamization and Lebanization of Israel. If you were to do that, for instance, the amount of budget resources that would have to be diverted from the Jewish sector to the Muslim sector to somehow equalize socioeconomic gaps would be enormous and would catapult Israel back almost to third world status. It would affect the level of education, infrastructure, research, road development, etc., within the Jewish sector. And so I think it would also result in an accelerated Jewish emigration, which would, of course, upset all the demographic calculations. So I think that even if you started with a point of departure where you had a 35 to 40% Muslim minority and a 60 to 65% Jewish majority, that would be eroded away. And I think that that would result in, as I said before, the ethnic strife, the Lebanization of society, and eventually Islamization, because I think you'd have a shrinkage of the Jewish population from a marginal majority to a growing or to a shrinking minority. So that's what I think. The two-state solution doesn't address adequately the geographic imperative, and the one-state solution, the way that it's normally presented, as annexing the territory and enfranchising the Arab residents, I don't think addresses the demographic imperative. And so if you want to maintain Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, you need to devise a formula or a policy prescription that addresses both these imperatives simultaneously.
Have those comments that you just made about both the two and the one-state solution, have those issues been raised in the UN? Have they been discussed?
Not that I know of with any sort of robustness or assertiveness.
Why is that?
Well, I think if you look what happened at the UN a few days ago, I think that reflects the debacle of Israeli diplomacy. I think Israel has been appallingly remiss in presenting its case, presenting the facts. And I think that what happened a few days ago at the Security Council was inevitable, because Israel has been, as I said, so self-effacing and so unassertive in presenting these facts. It's been so bound by the dictates of political correctness. It's never been able to put these facts forcibly on the public agenda, because to do so leads you to a very politically incorrect conclusion.
I've heard you make reference to the hawk-dove game theory approach in this circumstance. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think, normally the political divide is characterized as left versus right. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, a negative connotation has been attached to right-wing people. But I think that's a completely misleading characterization of the political divide, particularly on the questions that we're discussing now. The real divide should be the divide between hawks and doves, mm-hmm. because there should really be no connection between your views on abortion or gay liaisons or welfare and the way you think you should confront tyrannical regimes. In fact, if you're looking at the Palestinian issue, I find it astounding that anyone who purports to have liberal credentials would support that, because basically what you're advocating is the establishment of yet another Muslim majority, homophobic, misogynistic tyranny. Now, why anyone who purports to be a liberal would endorse such an outcome is beyond me. And so I think the correct differentiation or the correct description of the political divide on the Middle East issue is between hawks and doves. It's not that one side desires peace and the other one is trying to incite warfare. No, both hawks and doves want to avert or want peace. But doves feel that you can tempt your adversary into making peace by offering concessionary gestures, whereas hawks believe that you can deter them from making war by adopting a robust and uncompromising stance. Now, sometimes doves are right and sometimes hawks are right. It just depends on the circumstances, because you can have two configurations of conflictual relations. On the one hand, you can have a situation whereby you make a concession and your adversary realizes you made a concession and interprets this as a gesture of goodwill and feels obliged to make a reciprocal concession. And so by a series of concessions and counter-concessions, this diverges into some sort of amicable resolution. Right. On the other hand, you can have another configuration whereby you make a concession and your adversary perceives this not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. So instead of feeling obliged to make a conciliatory gesture, a reciprocal conciliatory gesture, they feel obliged or compelled to demand another concession because you're weak. And so instead of converging to some kind of amicable solution, it will diverge till eventually the situation descends into violence. And so the question is, what kind of situation we're in now? Because if you adopt a policy which is consistent with the first configuration, but you're actually in the second configuration, it's a recipe for disaster, because you instead of making a peaceful gesture, you're making a gesture of weakness, which will eventually precipitate warfare.
I've heard some argue that we already have two states, looking at Bloc A and Bloc B as being sovereign areas under the Palestinian Authority control. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, I think that's a ridiculous claim. In fact, I think all the approaches which talk about partial annexation are totally misguided. You know, the leader of this particular paradigm is the Minister of Education, Naftali Bennett.
Mm-hmm.
And what he says sounds very reasonable at first glance. Because what he says, we'll annex Area C, which contains most of the Jewish population and very few of the Arab population. And we'll give the 100,000 Arabs, or whatever it is, Jewish Israeli citizenship, so there'll be no claims of ethnic discrimination. And we'll let the Palestinian Arabs manage their affairs in areas A and B. Now, this sounds reasonable until you look at the map. If you look at the map, you'll see that Area C is not a continuous area with contiguous territory. It's a patchwork of enclaves and corridors, and it's with a frontier. I've never measured it, but I'd be surprised if it's less than 2,000 kilometers, which would be impossible to demarcate and impossible to secure. Now, if you can't demarcate and secure your sovereign territory, it's got no meaning. Your sovereignty's got no meaning, and and you will have no way of preventing Arabs in areas A and B from drifting into Area C, especially if the economic conditions there are better, and totally disrupting your initial demographic calculation. But let's suppose I'm wrong, and you could do that. I don't know how you could, but let's suppose you could. What do you tell the rest of the world that you're going to do with 90% of the Arabs encapsulated in 40% of the land, also of disconnected enclaves and corridors? You know, he's got this theory that there's this maze of dizzying overpasses and underpasses that you're going to collect. Oh, really? You know, it'll take you 40 years to build something like that. So I think it's a completely unfounded solution. You know, I'm trying not to be too harsh in my criticism. And the political pain involved in annexing 60% of the territory was probably indiscernibly different from the political pain involved in annexing 100%. You know, I don't think the world will accept that with any more benign attitude than if you annexed 100%, especially when you still have to tell them what you're going to do with 90% of the Arabs and 40% of the territory.
Right.
You know, so I don't think that there's any political gain or any practical gain in doing it. I mean, I think you have to annex all the territory, but you cannot do it by annexing in stages. I mean, you might be able to do something symbolic, like annexing Maria Adumim, which is near Jerusalem. You might be able to do it because it doesn't add so much. And that's the same problem with the theory of annexing the major settlement blocks. Because if you include Ariel in that settlement blocks, what's the border going to look like? How are you going to get to Ariel? You need secure access. So you need, I don't know, 20-kilometer finger going into Palestinian territory, and it needs to be secured from the flanks. You know, and then you're going to have to find some sort of land exchange. What land exchange are you going to find to compensate the Palestinians for that access into Ariel?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with by the way, Ma'ale Adumim, because then you have to annex area E1, which is the area that's between Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem proper. So I think people really haven't thought things through when they talk about annexing partial annexation, or even annexing the major settlement blocks, which no Palestinian agrees to anyway.
I'm interested also in your personal opinion about what really needs to happen here. I wonder if you're talking about something completely new.
Well, I think it's completely new. Other people have suggested similar things. I think what I've sort of wrapped it in a different wrapping.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't really think it's a personal opinion. I think it's almost a mathematical deduction.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you accept, which I think is almost axiomatic, for Israel to endure as the nation state of the Jewish people, it has to contend effectively either with both the geographic and the demographic imperatives. Because if it doesn't, it will either be untenable demographically or geographically or both. If you accept that, then you have to come to the conclusion that Israel needs to hold the territory and reduce the Arab presence west of the Jordan River. Now, there are two ways to do that: coercively or non-coercively, or say kinetically and non-kinetically. I suggest we try and do that non-kinetically. And the only way I think you can go about that is by offering economic inducements to the Arab population to leave that will make them relatively wealthy immigrants in many countries. And I think that has to be accompanied. I mean, these incentives for leaving need to be accompanied by disincentives for staying. And I think what you have to do is treat Palestinians as what they say they are, the enemy. And I think it's totally immoral to supply water, energy, power, postal services, tax collection services, port services to people who are trying to kill your population. So I'm not suggesting a dramatic denial of services, but I think what you need to do is make it clear that we're starting to face denial of services and to avoid the humanitarian suffering that this will probably cause. We're offering every non-belligerent Palestinian the opportunity to build a better life for himself elsewhere. Now, sometimes people are taken aback by this as if it's an immoral suggestion. But I find it remarkable. No one thinks that it's immoral to offer Jewish residents of Judea and Samaria financial inducements to get them to leave their homes, to facilitate the establishment of this homophobic, misogynistic Muslim majority tyranny, which will be a haven for Islamic terror on the fringes of Tel Aviv and probably Cyprus and Greece as well. That's okay. But everyone recoils in horror when you say, well, let's pay the Arab residents to leave their homes to prevent the establishment of said homophobic, misogynistic tyranny. Why? Are people going crazy? You know, I cannot understand it. It seems to me completely inconceivable.
When I worked in Nicaragua with indigenous groups there, and they gained final full sovereignty over their lands, they were guaranteed through the government process the rights to remove colonists, and we quite frankly called them illegal colonists. The most difficult part of that seemed to be that we didn't have a plan. We didn't have a place where they could go. We didn't have money that we could give them. We didn't have anything to offer them, so they've stayed. And because of that, it continues today to be one of the most contentious issues for them. To this very day, people are getting shot or killed just walking along their borders of their family farms that they've held for millennia. So what kind of a specific plan could we offer? I know that the refugee status of Arabs from this area are considered refugees for only staying for 2 years, and then in any country that they might migrate to would be perpetually named refugees of Palestine. So could you talk a little bit about more of the specifics of how a solution like that could work?
Well, you know, I can't really control people's emotions and sentiments and longings for some imagined homeland. But I think that if the disincentives for staying and the incentives for leaving were strong enough, I think you could. I mean, you look at what's happening in Gaza today. In Gaza, people are paying huge sums to have themselves smuggled out of Gaza.
Really?
Yeah, there was an article at Al Jazeera about that, and during the last military campaign, Protective Edge, people were fleeing, and there were stories of them being smuggled out with Egyptian smugglers, and being abandoned at sea, and boats capsizing and 500 drowning. So you know, if they had an alternative, I think they'd leave. I mean, I'm not sure that the massive Muslim influx into Europe indicates a huge longing of Muslims to stay in their homeland. Otherwise, they wouldn't be going to Europe.
Right.
And the immigration there in many ways is economic as well. But what I'm saying is, I don't want to choose the destination of the Palestinians. I want to leave it as an individual choice. But I want to give them enough money so that they will be desired immigrants. They will fulfill the economic requirements for a range of countries. I mean, there are 500,000 Palestinians living in South American countries, and even more. I believe it's a matter of political resolve on the Israeli side, because no one else can basically construct and preserve the parameters needed for Israel to remain the nation state of the Jewish people.
Right.
If they don't do it, there won't be a Jewish state. For 2,000 years, there wasn't a Jewish state. Nothing happened to the world. People continued to have families and go to cinemas and go to restaurants, etc., etc. And if the Jews do not undertake the steps they need to maintain their state, they won't have one. It'll either be eroded away slowly, or it'll be demolished in a catastrophic military conflict, one of the two, or maybe a combination of both. But if the Jews don't do what they need to do to maintain their nation state, they'll lose it. And I think what's happened is, because of the tremendous success of Israeli security forces, the level of national adrenaline has dropped to a dangerous level, and people are complacent. I don't think they feel the fragility and the danger.
Mm-hmm.
You have there's a group of high-ranking military officers going around now trying to sell the idea of unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria. They say, well, there's no one to talk to, but we have to preserve the option of a two-state solution, because that's the only way we can keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state. Mm. So we'll declare that we've got no sovereign claims beyond a certain line, roughly the security barrier. But to prevent making the same mistake as we made in Gaza, we'll leave the IDF there. So I said to them, how long are you going to leave the IDF there? And if you say it's not your sovereign territory, what's the rationale for leaving the IDF there? And says, until we have security. And I said, you guys are crazy. Because the immediate argument is, of course you've got no security, you're an occupying force. And in a stroke, you've converted the IDF from the Israeli Defense Force to the Israeli occupying force, and you've converted the entire area of Judea and Samaria into a giant South Lebanon, because that's what South Lebanon was. You had the Israeli Defense Force deployed in an area which Israel claimed that it had no sovereign right to. So what you're doing is exactly what you had in Lebanon, but only on a major scale.
I've heard also that the Supreme Court decision that they recently made on the Amona community is something that maybe is reflective of this idea.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my expertise is not law. But first of all, the Supreme Court doesn't have evidence. And apparently the legal establishment within the government made a very feeble effort protecting them. But the whole thing is ridiculous. They are now reportedly allotting 155 million shekels to demolish and move the Amona residents to a new location. Imagine if you took 5% of that and offered it to the Arab to buy his land. It's beyond his wildest, beyond his wildest dreams. So you wouldn't be actually seizing the property or depriving him of his wealth. You'd be maximizing his wealth. And the real thing, the real issue that the human rights organization should be addressing. It's the brutality of why he's not doing that. Because the laws, the Palestinian Authority and Jordan, impose the death penalty on anyone selling land to Jews. That's the real violation of human rights, because you don't allow this poor Palestinian to maximize the value of his property. But the human rights organizations don't deal with that. No, they only deal with the fact that we've expropriated Palestinian property. No, you know what? If that happened in the Green Line, it would have been settled by compromise, by monetary compromise. It's only because it's outside the Green Line and that the settlement has been so deprecated and denigrated that these common sense solutions aren't operative. I mean, you imagine you come to this Palestinian, you offered him a couple of million shekels for this rocky plot of land. What, he wouldn't take it? Of course he'd take it, but he can't because he's under the threat of death by his own countrymen. And by the way, there's documented evidence of some of these left-wing human rights organizations of handing over Palestinians to the Palestinian Authority.
Those that are selling the land.
Yeah,
making it like a death sentence.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow, that's just unbelievable. It's really hard to,
to
understand that an international
that's
human rights agency.
That's the whole point. These human rights organizations are not human rights organizations. They radical political organizations that use the banner of human rights to accomplish their political aims. Because if they were really human rights organizations, they wouldn't want to set up a homophobic, misogynistic, Muslim majority tyranny. And they would allow these poor Palestinians to sell their land, get more money beyond their wildest dreams, and go and live a decent life elsewhere. You know, it's not only my opinion. People like Herbert Hoover, the great humanitarian, suggested this. Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, also said, with all the money being spent on this, you could have relocated the Palestinians and given them comfortable lives elsewhere, comfortable and secure. But that's not the aim. The aim is to extricate the land from Jewish control and make the Jewish state untenable geographically. And sadly, I think the Israeli establishment has been very remiss in recognizing the problem, certainly articulating the problem, and contending with it.
One last question, I guess. I'm curious about the recent claim by Namibia that the United Nations, under their charter, Chapter 7, have no ability to bind states to any kind of an action.
Well, I'm sure that's probably true. I think it's all a matter of political power. I mean, it's easy to put sanctions on a country like Serbia, that they do with South Africa. I'm sure that down the line, Israel has to gear for an option like that. But you couldn't do it in China. You couldn't do it to the United States. So I think it's a matter of political power rather than international law. There's some sort of obligatory national law because the members of the United States are all sovereign countries. And so I don't think that you could coerce a sovereign country to take part in some sort of communal or collective activity. You might be able to threaten them with sanctions if they don't. Again, that would depend on how those sanctions work out, because I don't believe that many Americans are going to be put on trial in the International Criminal Court. I don't think any Chinese would, and I'll be amazed if any Russians are.
But in this case, we might have Israelis.
But that depends, and again, this has been my argument for many years with the Israeli establishment, that the greatest strategic challenge and the gravest strategic failure and the biggest strategic threat to Israel is the conduct, or rather the misconduct, of its public diplomacy. Because, in my opinion, diplomacy today has a function very similar to that of the classic function of the Air Force. The Air Force's classic function was to generate enough freedom of movement on the ground for the ground troops to be able to achieve their objectives. Diplomacy does that on a higher level, it should generate the freedom of action for the strategic decision makers to reach their objectives. Unfortunately, in Israel, in many ways, the relationship has been inversed. Instead of strategic goals being the independent variable and your diplomacy being your strategic goals being the independent variable and your diplomacy being the dependent variable, which should be tailored to allow you to achieve those objectives. It's been inverted, and diplomatic difficulties have been the determinants of your strategic goals. And I think that's a very dangerous situation that's evolved. I think Israel should set its strategic goals and then allot its diplomacy sufficient resources to achieve those goals. Now, if you look at, let me put it very bluntly, I think Israel is losing the battle for hearts and minds in the international community for a very simple reason. Very easy to prove, very difficult to accept. And I think the reason that Israel is losing the battle for hearts and minds in the international community is because it doesn't want to win, for some reason. Now, as I said, it's difficult to accept, but it's easy to prove. Because if you look, if an organization wants to achieve a certain objective, you can gauge its motivation to achieve that objective by the amount of resources that it allots for the achievement of that objective.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the resources allotted for Israel's public diplomacy, it's a joke. It's really a joke.
Wow.
It's literally less than a medium to large size company in Israel spends on promoting fast foods and snacks globally.
Wow.
Okay.
That's
Now,
incredible.
if Israel were to allot 1% of the state budget, that's $1 billion. With $1 billion, you can change a lot of minds. Especially if, since Netanyahu has been in power for the last 8 years, if he had allotted $1 billion for 8 years for assaulting public opinion in the West, for public opinion assaults on university campuses in the United States, I believe Israel's situation will be completely different today. But because of the miserly allotment of resources for winning hearts and minds, we're losing them. We're losing them. We're losing the next generation in America. We're even losing evangelicals in America because our case is not put forward with sufficient robustness, sufficient assertiveness, and sufficient conviction. And it's very difficult because the moment that Netanyahu accepted the two-state solution in Bar Ilan, Israel was in a possible situation. Because to set up any viable Palestinian state, you have to make concessions that are too dangerous for Israel to make, and so it cannot. So you cannot match your declarations with actions, and therefore you appear disingenuous.